There is a detail about medieval marriage that most people quietly get wrong. They imagine it as public ceremony, a grand announcement, a procession through the great hall, a feast laid out on long tables with candles burning and music rising, and sometimes it was. But sometimes, in the shadows of the very same castle where the feast would later take place, a marriage had already happened, quietly, in a small room, with only 2 or 3 witnesses present, and the entire court would not know for days, or weeks, or in some extraordinary cases, for years. The question worth sitting with tonight is not what happened during the wedding, but what happened before it, in all the hours and days and small private moments that preceded a union that had been decided long before the 2 people involved had any say in the matter at all. To understand what happened before a secret marriage in a medieval castle, it helps to first understand what marriage actually meant in that world. It was not primarily a romantic arrangement. It was a legal instrument. It transferred land, bound families, created alliances and produced heirs. A marriage between 2 noble families was closer in function to a treaty than to a love story. The emotions involved were considered secondary to the property and political consequences. And yet human beings have always been human beings. Even inside a system built entirely around inheritance and alliance, people fell in love, formed attachments, made promises in private that contradicted the arrangements being made in the public world of courts and councils. The tension between those 2 realities, the official and the intimate, is where the story of a secret medieval marriage truly begins. The legal framework for marriage in medieval Europe was provided almost entirely by the Church. Canon law, the body of rules governing Christian life and behaviour, held that a valid marriage required only 2 things: the free consent of both parties and the exchange of vows in the present tense, not a priest, not church, not a ceremony, not witnesses, though witnesses were strongly recommended. Simply the words spoken freely between 2 people who had reached the age of consent. For men, that age was generally set at 14. For girls, it was 12, and in practice, the betrothal of girls younger than 12 was not uncommon, with the understanding that the actual marriage would wait. These ages strike modern readers as deeply uncomfortable, and rightly so. But, within the medieval framework, they reflected Roman legal precedent and its view of childhood that was fundamentally different from our own. A world in which children were understood to become adults very quickly, and in which the prolonged, protected childhood familiar to contemporary societies simply did not exist in the same form. Because consent was legally sufficient for a valid marriage, a couple who exchanged vows privately, even in a garden, even in a bedchamber, even in a stable, had in the eyes of the Church contracted a binding union. This was not a loophole. It was the theological heart of marriage doctrine as understood in the medieval period. The great 12th century canon lawyer Gratian argued that consent alone made a marriage. His near contemporary Peter Lombard argued that consummation was also required. The Church spent much of the following 2 centuries working out which view to adopt, and the result was a doctrine that recognized both a marriage initiated by consent and completed by consummation. The practical consequence was that secret marriages were not just possible, but legally defensible. They were difficult to undo, and they happened with a frequency that caused enormous social and ecclesiastical concern. For the inhabitants of a royal or noble castle, this doctrinal flexibility existed inside a world of enormous social pressure. The marriages of noble children were not their own business. They were the business of their parents, their lords, the crown, and in the highest cases of international diplomacy. A princess might be promised to a foreign prince before she could walk. A young nobleman might find his future wife selected by his father when both children were still in the nursery. The machinery of aristocratic marriage ran on information, on knowledge of family wealth, political standing, fertility records, bloodlines, and the complex shifting web of allegiance and enmity that connected noble houses across Europe. To circumvent that machinery by marrying secretly was not merely a romantic gesture, it was an act with potentially serious political consequences, and everyone involved understood this perfectly well. The preparations that preceded a formal arranged noble marriage began years before the ceremony itself. A betrothal, the formal promise of future marriage, could be made very early in a child's life, and it carried real legal weight. A betrothal made between parties who had reached the age of 7 was considered binding in most jurisdictions of canon law. It could be dissolved, but only for serious reasons. The discovery of a prior betrothal, the development of an impediment such as close blood relationship, or the mutual consent of both families to release the agreement. Breaking a betrothal without cause carried social and sometimes legal consequences. The families involved understood the arrangement as a serious commitment, and the children were raised within it. Inside the castle, the life of the young woman who had been betrothed was shaped by that fact in very concrete ways. Her education, her movements, her companions, and her daily routine were all organized in relation to the marriage that had been arranged for her. She would be taught the skills appropriate to her future role, the management of a household, the supervision of servants, the basic literacy that would allow her to read prayers and accounts, the musical accomplishments that marked a cultivated woman of her class. If her betrothed was from a foreign court, she might begin learning his language while still a young girl, so that when she arrived in his country, she would not be entirely dependent on translators. Her ladies-in-waiting would sometimes be selected in part for their knowledge of the culture she was moving toward. The whole apparatus of her upbringing was aimed at producing a woman who would be useful and functional within the specific household she had been promised to. What that apparatus could not control was her inner life, and it is in the inner life, in the conversations overheard, the letters passed secretly, the moments stolen in corridors and garden paths, that the prehistory of a secret marriage takes shape. A young woman can find the women's quarters of a castle, whose daily movements were supervised, and whose companions were carefully chosen, nonetheless lived in a building full of people. There were male servants who brought firewood and carried messages. There were visiting knights who attended tournaments and feasts and passed briefly through the great hall. There were pages, young boys from noble families who served as personal attendants to lords and ladies and who moved freely between different parts of the castle. And there were the male relatives of her ladies-in-waiting, who sometimes came to visit and were briefly admitted to spaces where a carefully supervised nobleman might catch a glimpse, exchange a few words, receive a folded note. The physical geography of a medieval castle is important to understanding how secret communication worked within it. A large fortified residence of the 13th or 14th century was not a single building, but a complex of structures arranged around one or more courtyards, protected by walls of varying age and thickness, and filled with a population that could number in the hundreds when the full household was in residence. The great hall was the most public space, the room where the lord received visitors, where meals were eaten in the formal hierarchy of the high table and the lower tables, where announcements were made and business conducted. but the castle also contained chambers of increasing privacy. The solar, which was the family's private sitting room, the bedchambers, which were among the most restricted spaces, the chapel, where the household gathered for prayer, and which carried a particular kind of sanctity, and the many service spaces below and around these formal rooms, the kitchens, the larders, the storerooms, the kennels, the stables, the gardens. Within this geography, certain spaces were understood to be relatively free from direct supervision. The chapel was one such space. Prayer was a private matter, and a woman who wished to spend extra time in the castle chapel would rarely be refused. The garden was another, particularly in the warmer months when the women of the household took their needlework and conversation outside into an enclosed space that offered more air and light than the stone interior of the main buildings. These spaces were not unsupervised. A lady of high rank was almost never entirely alone, but they offered a relative looseness, a moment when attention might wander, when a note could be passed under a bench, when two people might stand briefly close enough to speak words that no one else could hear. The mechanics of secret correspondence in a medieval castle are worth considering in some detail, because they reveal a great deal about the ingenuity and determination that a clandestine relationship required. Writing itself was a skill possessed by a relatively small proportion of the population, though among the noble classes of the later medieval period, literacy was more common than is sometimes assumed. A young woman who had been taught to read her prayers could usually also write, at least simply. But even if she could write, producing a letter required materials, parchment or paper, which was expensive and carefully accounted for, ink, and a quill. Just the disappearance of these materials from a lady's writing desk might itself attract attention. Many secret communications were therefore written, but spoken, conveyed by a trusted intermediary, servant, a waiting woman, a page, who memorized a message and repeated it exactly. The trust required by this arrangement was enormous, and its failure was one of the most common ways that a secret relationship was discovered. A servant who overheard too much, a waiting woman who felt her loyalty lay with her mistress's family rather than her mistress, a page who mentioned something carelessly in the stable yard. These were the vulnerabilities of any clandestine arrangement. The history of medieval noble families contains a notable number of cases in which a secret relationship came to light not through dramatic discovery, but through the ordinary unreliability of the human beings who had been brought into its confidence. A lady's maid who felt slighted, a servant who owed a greater debt of loyalty to the lady's father than to the lady herself, a boy who simply talked too much. Against these vulnerabilities, the parties to a secret relationship deployed a range of countermeasures that reveal a sophisticated understanding of their social environment. Messages might be written in a simple cipher, not the complex cryptographic systems developed later, but a straightforward substitution that would be meaningless to a servant who found a note but couldn't read it. Meetings might be arranged through a chain of intermediaries, so that no single person knew both the sender and the recipient of a message. The content of private conversations might be disguised. A discussion of household business or religious observance that carried a second layer of meaning understood only by the two people speaking. A castle that appeared to an outsider to be functioning in its ordinary regular way might simultaneously contain a private exchange of communications that had been going on for months. The emotional texture of this situation, the combination of desire, fear, calculated deception and intense privacy, is something worth pausing to imagine. A young woman in her early teens, perhaps, who had been betrothed since childhood to a man she has never met, living in a castle that is simultaneously her home and her confinement, who finds herself in conversation with someone she has not been permitted to love, is navigating a situation of extraordinary complexity. She understands the stakes perfectly. The failure of her official betrothal would embarrass her family. A secret marriage, if discovered before it could be acknowledged, might be characterized as seduction, which carried its own set of social and legal consequences. And yet the pull toward connection, toward the private acknowledgement of feeling, toward something that belonged to her rather than to her family's political calculations, was powerful enough that many women in exactly this situation chose to act on it. It's important to say something here about the men involved in these arrangements, because the history of secret medieval marriages has often been told primarily from the perspective of romantic desire, with the woman as a passive object of pursuit. The reality was considerably more complicated. A young man who pursued a secret marriage with a woman already betrothed to someone else was taking a significant risk himself. If the woman's family was powerful, his could be ruined. If the woman's betrothed was a political ally of the crown, the young man might find himself facing consequences that extended well beyond the personal: confiscation of lands, imprisonment, exile. A secret marriage was not simply an act of romantic boldness. It was political manoeuvre, sometimes a calculated one, in which the man understood perfectly that the woman's consent, once given, transformed the entire landscape of her family's alliances. This does not mean that all secret marriages were cynically engineered. It means that even the genuine ones existed within a world where their consequences could never be disentangled from politics. A man who genuinely loved a woman he was not permitted to marry, and who persuaded her to exchange private vows with him, was simultaneously a romantic figure and a political actor. He was doing something that would reshape the alliance structures of two families. He understood this. She understood this. And both of them, in the days and weeks before the exchange of vows, were living inside the full weight of that understanding. The castle at night was a different place from the castle in daylight. The formal hierarchies of the great hall relaxed somewhat after the candles in the public spaces were extinguished. The lord and lady retired to their chambers. The servants moved through the building on their last tasks of the evening, banking the fires, carrying away the remains of supper, checking the locks on the outer gates. The great hall, which had been full of noise and motion for most of the day, fell into a quieter state, occupied mainly by those members of the household who had no private chamber, and who slept on benches or on the rushes near the central hearth. Guards moved at their posts. Somewhere in the building a baby cried and was hushed. The castle did not truly sleep. Too many people lived in it for complete silence, but it changed its character, becoming darker and more intimate, less supervised and less legible. It was in this nocturnal castle that some of the critical stages of a secret marriage's prehistory unfolded. A meeting that was impossible in the daylight hours, and when the great hall was full and every movement was visible, became conceivable in the darkness of a corridor, the shadows of a garden, the back of a chapel lit by a single candle, not because the castle was unguarded and the guards were there and they were awake, but because the guards were watching for external threats, for enemies approaching the walls, for fire, for the security of the gates. They were not watching the interior with the same intensity that they watched the approaches to the castle from outside, and the interior at night offered pockets of genuine privacy that the daytime hours did not. The chapel deserves special attention in this context. Almost every castle of any significance had its own chapel, sometimes quite small, sometimes larger and more elaborately decorated. The chapel was among the most consistently used spaces in the building. Morning Mass was a daily obligation for the household, and private prayer at the hours of the day was common and encouraged. The priest who served the castle chapel was a figure of considerable importance in the household, both as a spiritual authority and as a practical functionary. He kept records, wrote letters, and administered the religious life of the community. He also, in many cases, heard confessions, which gave him access to a kind of knowledge about the inner lives of the household's members that no other person possessed. The role of the castle chaplain in secret marriages is complex and historically interesting. On one hand, a chaplain who performed or witnessed a secret marriage was taking a real risk. He was potentially acting against the wishes of his lord, which could cost him his position, and he was participating in an act that, depending on the circumstances, might be characterized as a deception of the church. On the other hand, the theological framework was clear. If two parties consented freely and exchanged vows, the chaplain was witnessing a sacrament, not enabling a conspiracy. Some chaplains seem to have understood their role in these terms and acted accordingly, prioritizing what they understood to be the spiritual reality of the sacrament over the social and political consequences for their employer. Others refused or warned the Lord, or found ways to delay and discourage without outright refusing. The chaplain was, in his own way, a figure caught between institutional and personal loyalties, navigating the same complex terrain as everyone else inside the castle walls. The question of who else needed to be involved before a secret marriage could take place leads into a consideration of the domestic social structure of the castle. A young woman of noble birth was surrounded by waiting women, ladies of varying social status who served as her companions, attendants, and supervisors. Some of these women were older and had been placed in her household specifically to oversee her behaviour and report to her parents or guardians. Others were closer to her in age and temperament, and over the long years of shared life in the women's quarters, real friendships developed. The distinction between a lady-in-waiting who was a confidant and one who was a spy was not always obvious, and the woman at the centre of a developing secret marriage had to make judgments about these people that were, in practice, judgments about her own safety. The process by which a confidant was recruited into the secret of a developing relationship was slow and careful. Trust was built gradually through small confidences first, the sharing of feelings that were not dangerous in themselves, a gradual increase in intimacy that tested the waiting woman's discretion before revealing anything that could cause real harm. A lady who had decided to pursue a secret marriage would not, as a rule, reveal that plan all at once to some waiting woman she was not yet certain of. She would share something smaller, a feeling, an observation, a question about the theological status of a marriage made by private consent, and watch to see how it was received, and whether it appeared to travel beyond the room in which it was spoken. A waiting woman who became a genuine confidant entered a position of both privilege and danger. She was trusted with something that, if it became known, could bring serious consequences to everyone involved. She was asked to keep secrets from people, sometimes from the very lord and lady who employed her and who had the power to dismiss her, impoverish her, or worse. She was asked in some cases to actively deceive, to provide false information about her mistress's whereabouts, to carry messages and deny having done so, to maintain a performance of normalcy while facilitating something that violated the social order of the household she served. That women did this, and did it frequently enough to leave a clear pattern in the historical record, is a testament to the strength of the relationships that formed among women confined together in the close quarters of a castle household. The physical preparation for the exchange of vows, the moment that would, if everything went according to plan, constitute the legal marriage, was minimal by design. A secret marriage required precisely the opposite of the elaborate apparatus of a formal wedding. It required darkness, silence, a small number of witnesses, and a moment of privacy that had been carefully arranged. The vows themselves were simple. The formula that canon law required was brief, and it needed no special setting to be valid. What it required was that both parties speak freely without coercion in the knowledge of what they were saying. Everything that preceded the exchange of vows was in service of creating the conditions in which those words could be spoken. In the days immediately before the planned exchange, the atmosphere within the castle, or at least within the small circle of people who knew what was being planned, would have carried a particular quality of tension. Every conversation had a second layer. Every movement through the building was partly a navigation of risk. The woman at the centre of the arrangement was going about her daily life, attending mass, doing her needlework, sitting with her ladies, eating in the hall, while simultaneously carrying the knowledge of what was coming. She was performing normalcy while living inside something entirely abnormal. The psychological demand of this was not trivial. The people who managed it successfully were people of considerable self-control, who had learned in a social environment that valued public performance to maintain a face that showed nothing of what lay beneath it. It is worth pausing here to consider what the man in this situation was experiencing, because his circumstances were different from the woman's in ways that are relevant to understanding the event as a whole. A young man in a medieval noble household had more freedom of movement than a young woman of equivalent rank, but he was not unsupervised, and his actions were subject to social scrutiny in their own way. The masculine code of honour that governed noble behaviour in the medieval period was demanding in its own right. A man who was seen to be pursuing a woman inappropriately, particularly a woman who was betrothed to someone else, risked being characterised as lacking in honour, as a seducer, as someone who placed his own desire above the legitimate claims of another man's family. The romantic interpretation of his actions, which later centuries would sometimes apply, was not the interpretation that the medieval world around him was likely to offer. He was also, in most cases, operating with a clearer sense of the political landscape than the woman was. He would know or could estimate what the consequences of a discovered marriage would be. For himself, for his family, for his lord, for the woman's family. He would have made calculations about whether those consequences were manageable, and about the sequence of steps that would follow the exchange of vows. A secret marriage was not, in most cases, intended to remain secret forever. It was a fait accompli, an irreversible act that would eventually need to be acknowledged, and that the parties hoped, once acknowledged, would have to be accepted rather than undone. The man's strategy, in other words, was partly about the present and partly about the future, about how the secret, once it became known, would reshape the possibilities available to everyone involved. The kitchens of a medieval castle are an unlikely setting for the prehistory of a secret marriage, but they were in fact one of the places where information travelled with particular speed and reliability. The kitchen staff occupied a unique social position in the castle household. They were servants, but they were essential servants whose work could not be paused or ignored, to move through the building at all hours of the day and night in the performance of their duties. A kitchen boy carrying a load of firewood up from the wood store to the upper floors would pass through corridors and courtyards that a noblewoman would rarely visit. A cook's assistant delivering a plate of food to a private chamber had access to spaces that most of the household never entered. The kitchen staff were also, by the nature of their work, gatherers and distributors of information. They saw who entered and left the castle. They overheard conversations in the rooms where they worked. They knew, often before anyone else, when a guest had arrived unexpectedly, when a message had come in the night, when a lord was in a mood that suggested bad news, when a lady had been weeping. This knowledge was not theirs in any formal sense. They had no right to use it and no official standing that would allow them to act on it. But it circulated quietly and without formal acknowledgement through the servant community of the castle, providing a kind of informal intelligence network that was parallel to and sometimes more accurate than the official communications of the noble household above, a clandestine arrangement that required the services of a servant, a page to carry a message, a kitchen maid to pass something from one hand to another, was therefore entering to some extent into this parallel information network. The servant who carried the message became part of the secret, but also part of a social world in which secrets had a way of moving. A page who was given a letter to carry and told not to tell anyone might say nothing directly, but his behaviour, the unusually careful way he carried the letter, the slight change in his demeanour, the fact that he disappeared for longer than his errand required, was readable by the people around him, people who were experienced observers of exactly this kind of behavioural signal. The social world of castle servants was governed by loyalties that were, in many ways, more complex than those of their employers. A servant owed primary loyalty to the lord or lady who employed them, but that loyalty existed alongside a whole range of other obligations. To their family, to their home village, to their friends among the other servants, to the abstract ideals of their religious faith. A servant who was asked to facilitate something that placed one loyalty in conflict with another was navigating a moral situation that was, in its own way, as complex as anything being navigated by the noble family upstairs, and the consequences of choosing wrongly, of trusting the wrong person, of saying the wrong thing to the wrong person, could be severe. The women's quarters of a medieval castle were among the most carefully regulated spaces in the building. A great noblewoman's bedchamber and the rooms associated with it, her solar, her wardrobe room, the chapel of her private quarters, were spaces to which access was tightly controlled. Men of the household, with the exception of the lord himself, and certain specified servants performing particular tasks, were not supposed to enter these spaces. The women who lived in them were supposed to be protected by their physical separation from the rest of the household, and the management of access to those spaces was a significant part of the social governance of the castle. In practice, however, the absolute separation of men and women's spaces was difficult to maintain. The castle was a working building. It required constant maintenance, and the men who did that maintenance had to go where the work was. A window in the solar that needed repair would bring a carpenter into a space that was notionally reserved for women. The delivery of fuel, food and supplies created regular points of contact between the male service staff and the women's quarters. And the women themselves moved through the castle, to the chapel, to the great hall for meals, to the garden, to attend their lord or lady on public occasions, which meant that the geography of separation was always being navigated rather than simply observed. Within this geography, the points of contact between the women's spaces and the rest of the castle became, for those managing a secret relationship, significant sites of possibility. A doorway that connected the solar to an outside stair, usually used only for the delivery of supplies, became a point through which a message could be passed. A window overlooking the courtyard became a point of visual communication, a specific cloth hanging in a specific way signalling a specific meaning. The castle, which was architecturally designed to separate and control, was simultaneously full of small, physical details that could be repurposed by people who are highly motivated to find them. The question of the actual moment of the vow exchange is one that the historical record approaches obliquely. Most of what we know about secret medieval marriages comes from the records of the legal disputes that followed them, cases heard in ecclesiastical courts, where one or both parties or their families were attempting to have the marriage declared valid or invalid. These records are invaluable precisely because they required both parties and their witnesses to describe in detail what had happened, and when, and where, and in what words. The result is a remarkable body of testimony about the private mechanic of castle life, the specific rooms where vows were exchanged, the words that were spoken, the witnesses who were present, the time of day or night, the circumstances that had brought the parties together. From these records a picture emerges that is at once more ordinary and more intimate than the romantic fantasy of the secret medieval wedding might suggest. The vow exchange in most cases was not a dramatic ceremony. It was a brief and serious conversation between two people who understood exactly what they were saying. Sometimes it happened in a garden, sometimes in a chapel, sometimes in a private room, sometimes, and this detail appears in the records often enough to be significant, it happened in a doorway, a liminal space that was neither entirely public nor entirely private, where two people could stand for a few minutes without being obviously in violation of the rules about access to private spaces. The vows were spoken, a witness or two were present, and then, in most cases, the parties separated and returned to their ordinary lives, carrying the knowledge of what had just happened, while the world around them continued as before. The period immediately after the exchange of vows was in some ways the most dangerous. Thus, the marriage had been made, but it had not yet been acknowledged. It existed in a kind of legal and social suspension, valid by the rules of canon law, invisible to the rest of the world, and vulnerable to a range of challenges if it were to come to light under the wrong circumstances. A secret marriage that was discovered by an angry family before the parties had the chance to acknowledge it on their own terms could be characterized in ways that were damaging, as seduction, as manipulation, as deception. The parties needed to manage the moment of revelation carefully, and the management of that moment required further planning, further waiting, further performance of normalcy. The waiting woman, who had been the primary confidant, often played a crucial role in this period. She continued to carry messages, continued to maintain the performance of normality, and was in the best position to assess the mood of the household and advise on the timing of any revelation. She was also the person who, if the secret was discovered against the wishes of all concerned, would bear the brunt of the immediate anger. She was the one who had enabled the deception, who had been trusted and had betrayed that trust. Her situation, in the aftermath of a discovered secret marriage, was rarely comfortable, but in the period of waiting, She was often the essential hinge on which the entire arrangement turned. The great hall of the castle continued its daily life throughout all of this. Meals were eaten, business was conducted, visitors arrived and departed. The lord sat at the high table and received the reports of his stewards. The lady sat beside him and supervised the domestic running of the household. The pages served, the servants worked, the dogs lay by the fire. To anyone looking at this scene from outside us, or to anyone inside it who was not part of the secret, everything appeared exactly as it always had. The castle functioned, the hierarchy held, the performances that held the social world of the castle together were maintained with the same consistency that they had always been. Beneath that consistency something had changed. In one of the castle's many rooms, or in the space of a brief conversation in a doorway or garden, two people had exchanged words that could not be unsaid. The machinery of arranged marriage, the entire apparatus of betrothal and alliance and political calculation had been circumvented, not violently, not dramatically, but quietly, in the way that the most significant things in a medieval castle often happened. By words spoken in private, between two people who understood exactly what they meant. The story that the great hall told about itself was not yet the true story of what had happened. That story was being held for the moment in the silence of a few people who knew how to keep it. Keep the physical body of a young woman in the days after a secret exchange of vows was a carrier of a secret that the rest of the world could not read. She sat in her accustomed place at the high table. She bent over her needlework in the solar. She knelt in the chapel and said her prayers with the same measured devotion she'd always shown. Her face showed what it always showed, the composed, pleasant expression that was expected of a noblewoman of her position. And yet her body and her mind were occupied with something that none of the people looking at her could see. The extraordinary effort of maintaining this composed exterior over days or the weeks, the constant monitoring of her own expression, the careful management of every word and gesture, is something that the historical record does not often describe, but that the circumstances make entirely clear. The waiting was a particular kind of experience. It was not passive. She was actively managing her situation at every moment, making judgments, assessing risks, adjusting her behaviour in response to changes in the household's mood and dynamics. But yet the quality of suspension that prolonged waiting always has. She knew that the world as it appeared was not the world as it was. She knew that at some point the gap between appearance and reality would have to close. And she was living, day by day, in the uncertainty of not knowing exactly when that closure would come, or exactly what form it would take. The castle at its best, in these rare moments when the great hall was full, and the music was playing, and the food was good, and the company was easy, could produce a feeling of community, of belonging, of participation in something that extended beyond any individual life. The hierarchy that organised castle life was not always experienced as oppressive. For the people inside it, it was simply the structure of the world, and within that structure there were satisfactions and pleasures and connections that were real and sustaining. The loyalty of a waiting woman to her mistress was not simply an obligation. It was often also a genuine feeling, built over years of shared life in a space that, for all its restrictions, was also a home. It was within this texture of genuine community and real affection that the secret was held. The waiting woman who carried the messages was not doing so out of abstract principle, but out of love for a specific person whose happiness she valued. The page who'd been trusted with the letter was not betraying his lord out of calculation, but responding to a request from someone he served and, in his way, cared about. The chaplain who had witnessed the vows was not violating his institutional loyalties carelessly, but making a judgment about the relative weight of different obligations. The obligation to his employer, the obligation to the Church's doctrine of consent, and the obligation to the two human beings who stood before him asking for a sacrament. These small acts of loyalty and care, multiplied across the households of medieval Europe, produced the actual fabric of daily life in a way that the official records barely capture. The historical record of medieval noble marriage is rich in legal documents, in betrothal agreements and property transfers and ecclesiastical court proceedings. It is less rich in the texture of what people felt and how they navigated the gap between what was officially required of them and what they privately chose to do. But the gap was there, and it was crossed regularly, and the crossing of it left traces in court records, in family histories, in the occasional personal letter that survived, and in the accumulating evidence of a social world in which official structures and private realities were always in dialogue. The knowledge that a secret marriage had taken place within a castle altered, in subtle but perceptible ways, the atmosphere of every space where the people who held that knowledge moved. The chapel felt different to the waiting woman who had stood in it as a witness. The solar felt different to the woman who now knew herself to be married in a way that the world around her did not yet recognize. The corridor where a message had been passed felt different to the page who had carried it. These differences were invisible to anyone who did not share the knowledge, but they were real to those who did. The castle, which seemed from outside to be a uniform whole, was in fact made up of multiple overlapping realities, the official reality of hierarchy and arrangement, and the private reality of what the people inside it actually knew and felt and had done. This multiplicity is not unique to medieval castles. It is a feature of any social world in which official structures place demands on individuals that conflict with what those individuals privately want or believe or have already done. But the medieval castle is a particularly vivid sight for observing it, because the physical structure of the castle, its walls, its chambers, its hierarchy of spaces and access, made the tensions between official and private reality so concretely spatial. The spaces where secrets were kept were specific rooms, specific doorways, specific corners of the garden. The people who moved through those spaces were carrying specific pieces of knowledge that shaped every interaction they had within them. And at the centre of it all was the woman, young, probably, carefully educated, carefully watched, the subject of years of planning and calculation by the people who loved her and the people who had claims on her. She had done something that violated the plans that had been made for her, and she had done it not out of ignorance or thoughtlessness, but with a clear understanding of what she was doing and why. She had found a point of leverage in the theological framework that governed her world, the doctrine that consent was sufficient for marriage, and she had used it. Whether she would continue to be able to use it, whether the fait accompli she had created would ultimately hold against the pressure that would be brought to bear on it, was not yet clear. But for the moment, in the space between the exchange of vows and the inevitable reckoning that would follow, she was both exactly who she had always appeared to be and also somewhat entirely different. She was the castle's secret, and the castle, for its part, kept it, The architecture of a castle is designed to control. Every wall, every gate, every narrow staircase is a statement about who is permitted to go where and under what conditions. The castle is, in its bones, a machine for the exercise of power. Military power, certainly, but also social and domestic power. The placing of the women's quarters in a specific part of the building, the regulation of access to those quarters, the assignment of specific people as supervisors and companions, all of these are architectural and social expressions of the same underlying impulse, the desire to know at all times where everyone is, what they are doing and with whom. And yet the castle, for all its apparatus of control, could not ultimately prevent its inhabitants from being human. The people who lived inside it were not merely functions of the roles assigned to them. They were people with inner lives, with feelings that did not always align with their social positions, with the capacity for loyalty and friendship and love and deception. The castle contained them, but it could not entirely contain the reality of who they were. The secret marriage that happened in its corridors and chapels and garden walks was not a defeat of the castle's architecture of control, but a reminder of its limits, a reminder that the most carefully regulated social environment will always be inhabited by people who are more complicated than the categories assigned to them. The morning after a secret vow exchange was an ordinary morning in the castle. The bells rang for prime, the household gathered for mass in the chapel. The kitchen fires were lit for breakfast. The steward began his rounds of the accounts. The horses were fed and watered in the stables. The lord sat down to his or her correspondence and the first business of the day. The lady supervised the beginning of the day's domestic work. Everything proceeded as it always had. The great hall, which would fill again by midday with the noise and movement of a working noble household, was still quiet, lit by the pale light that came through its high windows in the early morning. And somewhere in the castle a young woman who now knew herself to be married was going about the beginning of that ordinary morning, performing its ordinary rituals, maintaining its ordinary appearances, while carrying inside her the weight and lightness of something that had changed everything and that would, in time, change the world around her as well. The secret would keep for now. The world she moved through would keep its familiar shapes for now. But the space between what appeared to be true and what was actually true had opened, and there was no way to close it that did not involve a reckoning of some kind. That reckoning was coming. But for now the castle was quiet. The bells had finished ringing. The mass had begun. And in the chapel, among the other members of the household gathered there, the woman who held the castle's secret knelt and folded her hands and directed her eyes toward the altar and gave nothing away. The rooms of a castle remember nothing. The stone does not hold the sound of whispered words. The flagstones of the corridor do not preserve the careful footstep of a waiting woman carrying a folded note. The garden wall does not record the brief conversation that changed everything. The chapel does not retain the presence of two people standing close together in the candlelight, speaking words that had the force of law. And yet the rooms were where these things happened. They were the container of the event, and for the people who lived in them, they were never quite the same afterward. Every space that had been part of the story carried, for those who knew the story, a slight additional charge, a quality of significance that was invisible to anyone who did not share the knowledge but entirely present to those who did. This is one of the quieter aspects of the interior life of a medieval castle, the way that events accumulated in its spaces leaving no physical trace but changing the subjective experience of moving through those spaces for the people who had been present. A room where something important had happened was, for the rest of one's time in the castle, a room where something important had happened. The memory lived in the people rather than the stone, but the people lived in the stone, and so, in a sense, the memory and the stone were not entirely separate. The castle chapel, more than any other space, accumulated this kind of charged memory. It was the site of the daily rituals that structured the household's religious life, and it was also the site of the significant passages, the baptisms, the marriages, the funeral masses, the private moments of prayer in times of crisis. For a woman who had made a secret vow in its space, the chapel was never afterwards simply the chapel. It was also the place where she had said the words that changed her life. She carried this knowledge every time she entered it, every time she knelt on its stone floor, every time she looked at the altar where the candles burned. The political consequences of a secret noble marriage, when it eventually came to light, were rarely simple. They involved negotiations between families, conversations with church authorities, and in some cases appeals to the secular court or the crown. The legal status of the marriage, valid under canon law by virtue of consent, but potentially subject to challenge on various grounds, was the lever around which most of these negotiations turned. A family that wanted to undo a secret marriage had to find a ground on which to challenge the validity of the consent. The most common grounds were the existence of a prior binding betrothal, the claim that the consent had been given under coercion rather than freely, or the discovery of a canonical impediment such as close blood relationship between the parties. None of these challenges was necessarily easy to make stick. Canon law was clear that consent freely given made a marriage valid. The existence of a prior betrothal could be a complication. But if the betrothal had not been consummated and the marriage had been, the marriage generally took precedence. The claim of coercion was difficult to prove, particularly if the woman herself maintained that her consent had been free. And the discovery of an impediment, while it could be decisive, required evidence that the parties were related within the prohibited degrees, which was not always available. In many cases, the family that opposed secret marriage found itself with fewer legal tools than it had hoped, and was forced to accept a situation that it could not undo. This is one of the reasons that secret marriages were not merely romantic fantasies, but sometimes calculated political strategies. The woman who understood canon law, who had thought through the consequences of exchanging private vows before her family could arrange a different marriage for her, was using the legal framework of her world as an instrument of agency. She was not escaping the rules. She was using one set of rules, the Church's rules about the primacy of consent, to override another set of rules, the family's expectations about the management of her marriage. The sophistication of this strategy and its regular appearance in the historical record suggests that many women in the medieval period had a much more nuanced understanding of the legal possibilities available to them than is sometimes assumed. The education of a noble girl in the medieval period was not, despite common assumption, entirely devoted to domestic skills. Girls of the upper nobility were educated in reading, in Latin sufficient for liturgical use, in music, in the management of accounts, and particularly in the later medieval period, in the basics of law and property management. The wives of great lords needed to understand the legal instruments that governed their husbands' estates, because they were expected to manage those estates in their husband's absence, and in the long absences that war and travel imposed, that management was not a theoretical exercise. A woman who had grown up watching her mother manage a large castle household, negotiate with stewards and tenants, and handle the correspondence of a lord who was frequently away, had received an education in practical governance that was extensive and serious. Part of this education, necessarily, was an education in the legal framework that governed a noble life, the terms of betrothal agreements, the rules of inheritance, the procedures of the ecclesiastical court. A girl who grew up in this environment absorbed, alongside the domestic schisms that were the official content of her education, a practical knowledge of the legal instruments that shaped her world. That knowledge included in most cases an awareness of the doctrine of consent in marriage law. The girls who used that doctrine to make their own marriages were not ignorant of its implications. They knew exactly what they were doing and why it might work. The long evenings in the solar, which were a central feature of the women's domestic life at a medieval castle, were occasions for needlework and music and storytelling. The stories told in these settings were not all romances, though romances, the narrative literature of the medieval period that told stories of knights and ladies and the adventures of love, were certainly part of the repertoire. They were also practical histories, the accumulated oral tradition of what had happened to women in specific situations, how a particular woman had managed a difficult situation, what had happened when a betrothal had gone wrong, what the outcome had been in a case where a secret marriage had been made and then discovered. These stories circulated among the women of noble households and constituted a kind of informal education in the possibilities available to women who found themselves in difficult situations. The woman at the centre of a developing secret marriage was, in this sense, drawing on a tradition that was not unique to her. She was one in a long series of women who had found themselves in conflict between family expectation and personal desire, and who had used the tools available to them, so that the doctrine of consent, the physical possibilities of castle architecture, the loyalty of trusted companions, to act on that conflict. She was not inventing a strategy, she was inheriting one, though the inheritance was oral and informal and left no direct traces in the record. The formal record of the medieval world is dominated by men, because men controlled the instruments of formal record-keeping, the legal documents, the chronicles, the administrative accounts. The informal record, the oral tradition that circulated among women in the households of medieval Europe, is largely lost, but its effects are visible. The pattern of secret marriages, with their characteristic use of canon law, their reliance on female networks of complicity, their negotiation of castle geography, and their eventual resolution through ecclesiastical courts. This pattern is consistent enough across different times and places to suggest a shared body of practical knowledge. Women knew how it had been done. They knew because other women had told them in the evenings in the solar, in the casual conversations of shared domestic life. The castle as a social world, then, was not the monolithic hierarchy that its official architecture suggested. It was a layered and complex social space in which official structures and informal ones existed in constant negotiation. The official hierarchy placed the lord at the top and organized everyone else in relation to him. The informal hierarchy, the one that operated through trust and loyalty and shared knowledge, organized people in relation to each other, in patterns that did not always align with the official one. A waiting woman who was trusted with a secret had, in that moment, a kind of power over the person who trusted her that had nothing to do with their relative social positions. A chaplain who knew what had happened in his chapel was in possession of information that gave him a relationship to his lord and lady that was more complex than his official status suggested. This complexity was not a dysfunction of the castle system. It was, in a sense, its essential character. The castle was not a simple machine that ground its inhabitants into predetermined shapes. It was a social world, with all the texture and complication that social worlds contain. The official rules and the unofficial realities existed together in a permanent negotiation that produced the actual lived experience of everyone inside the walls. And somewhere in the middle of all this, in the gap between official and unofficial, between public and private, between the story the castle told about itself and the story that was actually being lived, was the secret marriage, compact and irreversible, already accomplished, though not yet acknowledged, waiting in the patient way that secrets wait for the moment when it would move from the private world into the public one and become part of the official story. That moment was coming. But for now, in the quiet hours of an ordinary day in a medieval castle, it waited. And the people who held it went about their lives, performing the roles that were expected of them, saying the things that were expected of them, moving through the familiar spaces of their daily existence, carrying the secret between them like a stone that was also, in its own way, a key. The history of medieval and noble marriage, when read carefully, is full of moments exactly like this, full of the spaces between events, the quiet hours before revelations, the domestic routines that continued uninterrupted while significant things were being decided in private. Most of what we call history is a history of events. Things that happened, things that changed, things that left a mark on the record. But the texture of life is mostly made of the time between events, the ordinary days when nothing is happening in the historical sense, but when people are living fully, carrying their knowledge and their decisions and their private realities through the familiar motions of their daily existence. It is this texture, the sound of the chapel bell calling the household to prime on an ordinary morning, the smell of the kitchen fires starting in the early light, the feeling of cold stone under bare feet, the weight of elaborate dress, the taste of the morning ale, the murmur of prayer said and heard and said again, that the bedtime history tries to recover. Not the drama of the event, but the ordinariness that surrounded it. The event happened. It changed things. But it happened inside an ordinary life, in the midst of an ordinary day, and the ordinary life continued before and after it. And it was the ordinary life that most people in the castle were living most of the time. The woman who held the secret went to mass with the household. She ate her breakfast. She sat down to her needlework. She answered when spoken to and said the right things. Their castle continued to be the castle. Stone and hierarchy and routine and labour and all the small pleasures and discomforts of daily life inside a great medieval household. And somewhere in the middle of all that ordinariness, a door had been opened that could not be closed. The future was already different from what had been planned. It just did not know it yet. That quiet gap between the private reality and the public one is where the story of what happened before a secret marriage in the castle lives. Not in the drama of the event itself, but in all the days that preceded it, the slow accumulation of trust, the careful navigation of geography, the education in legal possibility, the weight of sustained performance, the brief and serious exchange of words that changed everything. That is where the story is. In the ordinary days, in the stone corridors, in the chapel candlelight and the solar full of needlework and quiet conversation, in the castle that kept it secret for a while, as it kept everything within its walls, within its hierarchy, within the daily routines that were simultaneously the structure of an institution and the texture of a life. Consider for a moment the particular quality of a secret shared by very few people inside an institution that depends entirely on the shared fiction of normalcy. The castle was not merely a building. It was a performance, a daily enactment of hierarchy, of loyalty, of order. The lord performed lordship. The servants performed service. The ladies performed the femininity expected of them. These performances were not cynical. They were genuine expressions of social identity, of who these people understood themselves to be within the world they inhabited. And yet they were also performances, in the sense that they required effort and attention, and the continuous choice to behave in ways that reinforced the social order rather than undermining it. Into this world of social performance, the secret marriage introduced a split. The woman at its centre was now performing two things simultaneously. The role of the unmarried noble daughter, faithfully preparing for the marriage her family had arranged, and the private reality of a woman who had already contracted a different marriage by her own choice. The gap between these two identities was not comfortable. It was not even, in the long run, sustainable. But in the short term, it was manageable, because the social performance required of her was so deeply habituated that she could maintain it even while carrying knowledge that contradicted it at every moment. The castle garden in summer was one of the few spaces in the castle where the social performances could relax slightly. The enclosed garden, typically planted with herbs, flowers, and small fruit trees surrounded by walls or hedges, was a space associated with women's labour and leisure. Here the ladies of the household came to gather plants for the still room, to take the air, to conduct the quieter pleasures of outdoor life that the great hall did not offer. It was a supervised space, but it was a space where supervision was less formal, where conversations flowed more naturally, where the ordinary pressures of public life are slightly diminished. For a woman carrying a secret, the garden offered a particular kind of refuge. The sound of birdsong and the smell of herbs and the physical movement of gathering plants or tending flowers were things that required the hands and the arts without completely occupying the mind, leaving a space for private thought that the needlework in the solar, with its constant proximity to other women's conversation, sometimes did not allow. She could think in the garden. She could, occasionally, speak quietly to a companion without being overheard. And she could, in the castle's annual rhythm of seasons, measure the time that was passing. The weeks since the vow had been exchanged, the weeks remaining before the situation would have to be resolved. The women who tended the castle's garden were a distinct group within the domestic staff, and their relationship to the great household was different from that of the indoor servants. They worked outside in weather good and bad, in a space that was both practical and decorative. The herbs they cultivated were used in the kitchen and in the still room, where remedies, preserves, and preparations were made, and in the chapel, where flowers were brought for decoration on feast days. Their knowledge was accumulated and practical, passed from older women to younger ones in exactly the same informal way that the oral tradition of castle management was passed from lady to lady in the solar above. They knew the properties of plants, the timing of seasons, the practical chemistry of the still room. They were in their own way scholars of a kind, scholars of the natural world that existed just outside the castle walls. The still room itself is worth pausing to describe, because it was one of the castle's least celebrated and most essential spaces, and because it played an expected role in the social life of the women's quarters. Located typically in a relatively quiet part of the castle, equipped with small furnaces, ceramic vessels, wooden shelves lined with dried herbs and preparations, and the pervasive smell of beeswax and lavender, and the sharper notes of medicinal plants. The still room was managed by the lady of the castle or under her direct supervision. Here the household supply of candles was rendered from tallow and beeswax. Here vinegars and medicines and preserves were prepared. Here the work of the garden was converted into the materials that sustained the daily life of the building. The still room was a space of knowledge, and it was a space of relative privacy. The work done there was skilled work, requiring attention and precision, and it was not work that the entire household interrupted casually. A noble woman who wished to spend time in the still room without detailed supervision had legitimate reason to be there, and the work she was doing was considered properly feminine and properly serious. In the weeks that preceded a secret exchange of vows, a woman who needed time to think or to speak quietly with a trusted companion might find in the still room a convenient retreat from the more public spaces of the castle. The preparation of the still room also required the acquisition of specific materials: herbs from the garden, rendered fats from the kitchen, spices from the stores managed by the steward. This acquisition was itself a form of movement through the castle's spaces, a legitimate reason to be in contact with people in various parts of the building. A message passed along with a request for pepper, a note folded into a bundle of dried herbs, a brief conversation at the kitchen door, and these possibilities were not theoretical. They were part of the practical mechanics of castle communication that clandestine arrangements used regularly. The spice stores managed by the steward deserve a mention here, because they were among the castle's most valuable and carefully guarded assets. Spices in the medieval period were not merely flavourings. They were luxury goods with market value comparable to precious metals imported from the Far East through complex trading networks and stored in locked chests in the steward's keeping. Access to the spice store was controlled and accounted for, and the records of spice usage were among the most carefully maintained in the castle's domestic accounts. This is relevant to the prehistory of the secret marriage because it illustrates the degree to which the castle's domestic economy was both controlled and pervious. The controls were real, but the flow of materials and information between spaces was equally real, and people who understood the system could work with it rather than against it. The castle steward, who managed the household's accounts and oversaw the practical running of the domestic establishment, was in many ways the most powerful figure in the castle, below the lord and lady themselves. He knew the castle's finances, he supervised the staff, he managed the stores, he controlled access to resources, and he was, in most cases, a man of considerable intelligence and loyalty, who had been chosen for his position precisely because he could be trusted. The steward's relationship to the private life of the noble family was complicated. He knew a great deal about what went on in the household, probably more in some ways than the lord and lady themselves, because his position required him to track the movement of resources and people across the entire building. A steward who noticed something anomalous, an unusual request for materials, a servant who was moving through the castle at unexpected times, a consumption of candles or paper that didn't match the household's normal patterns, might or might not draw conclusions from what he observed, and might or might not act on those conclusions. Most stewards, in most castles, chose a kind of deliberate curiosity about the private affairs of the family they served. The job was to manage the household, not to police the family's intimate life. But there were limits to this incuriosity, particularly in cases where the interests of the lord were directly threatened. A steward who believed that his lord's political alliances were being undermined by something happening under his own roof had as an obligation to say so. And the most trusted stewards were trusted precisely because they could be relied on to exercise that judgment correctly. The relationship between the steward and the family he served was, in this sense, a relationship of mutual dependence and mutual accountability, in which the steward's ability to see a great deal was balanced by his discretion about what he chose to notice. The dogs of a medieval noble household were, oddly enough, another element of the castle's information infrastructure. The great hunting dogs that were central to full leisure were kennelled in a separate space near the stables, but the smaller dogs, the lapdog breeds that noble ladies kept as companions, and the working dogs that moved freely through the silding, were everywhere, and they were perceptive in ways that their owners both relied on and were occasionally troubled by. A dog that greeted someone with unusual enthusiasm, or barked at a familiar figure whose scent carried something unfamiliar, or refused to settle in a space that it usually occupied calmly, was communicating information to everyone in the room in a language that was entirely legible to people who spent their lives surrounded by animals. This may seem like a tangential detail, but in a world in which the movements and moods of everyone in the castle were tracked with careful attention, the behaviour of animals was part of the system of observation. A dog that became agitated in the corridor outside a room where a secret meeting was taking place was a risk. A dog that behaved in an unusual way with a person whose status in the household was being concealed was an inadvertent informant. The people who managed clandestine arrangements in the castle were people who understood this, and who factored it into their calculations with the same attention they gave to human surveillance. The horses in the castle stables tell a different part of the story. The movement of a horse's in and out of a castle was one of the most legible forms of social communication available to medieval observers. A horse being prepared for a journey signalled that someone was about to leave. A horse arriving in poor condition signalled a long and hard ride. The stable boys who cared for the horses were among the most informed people in the castle about the movements of everyone who came and went through the main gate, and their knowledge was exactly the kind of practical, observational, informal knowledge that circulated through the servant community and could reach, by various indirect routes, the ears of people who had reasons to know about unexpected arrivals and departures. The arrival of an unexpected visitor to the castle was always a significant event. Medieval hospitality required that travellers of noble rank be received and accommodated, and the arrival of a guest could reshape the social dynamics of the household for the duration of his or her stay. A young man who had legitimate reasons to visit a castle where the woman he had made private vows with was living, a relative of the lord, a guest at a tournament, a member of a diplomatic party, was in a position that was simultaneously precarious and useful. Precarious because his presence brought him under the scrutiny of everyone in the household, and because his behaviour toward the woman had to be calibrated to avoid showing anything that would reveal the private understanding between them. Useful because his presence in the castle created opportunities for the kind of brief, controlled, plausibly deniable contact that the ongoing management of a secret relationship required. The etiquette of medieval hospitality created its own kind of cover for these encounters. A guest was entertained, and the entertainment of a guest involved the public participation of the castle's household in a round of formal meals, music, and conversation. A guest was expected to speak with the ladies of the household, to dance with them at feast, to receive their company in the solar for the formal hours of conversation that constituted aristocratic leisure. These were public occasions, but they were occasions on which a great deal of private communication could be embedded in the public interaction. A word said under the cover of a song, a note passed between the hand that offered a cup and the hand that received it, a look that conveyed something too specific for a word. Medieval manuscript illuminations occasionally show these scenes of noble socializing, the long tables with their formal hierarchy, the musicians in the gallery, the servants moving between the tables, the ladies in their elaborate dress, the guests in theirs. What these images cannot show is the layer of private communication that ran beneath the public one, the additional text that accompanied the visible scene, like a whispered translation. The illuminators were recording the official version. The unofficial one lived in the gaps between the figures they painted, in the gestures too small to depict, and the words too quiet to hear. The light inside a medieval castle was a constant factor in a management of anything that needed to be done without witnesses. The great hall in daylight was lit by the light from its high windows, which was supplemented by candles and torches in the darker hours. Private rooms were lit primarily by candles, which were expensive and carefully allocated by the steward. The chapel was lit by candles and by the oil lamps that burned before the altar. The service areas, the kitchens, the storerooms, the corridors of the lower floors, were often lit only by the light that came in through small windows near the ceiling, and in winter or in the evening they could be very dark. This darkness was a social fact as well as a physical one. In a space where it was difficult to see clearly, it was also difficult to identify people with certainty. A person moving through a dark corridor was visible as a figure, but not necessarily recognizable as a specific individual. The social rules about who was allowed to be where were enforced partly by the ability of other people to see who was actually moving through the building, and in the dark hours that ability was reduced. This is one of the reasons that nighttime in the castle was understood as a more permissive social environment than daytime, not because the rules changed, but because the enforcement of the rules depended on visibility, and visibility at night was limited. The candles themselves were objects with a social history worth noting. In a castle household, different grades of candle were allocated to different members of the household. The lord and lady had access to the best beeswax candles, which burned cleanly and brightly. The upper household had candles of lesser quality. The lower household and the servants burned tallow dips, which were cheaper and smellier and provided less light. The allocation of candles was recorded in the household accounts, and any significant deviation from the expected consumption would be noticed and might require explanation. A room that required more candles than usual was a room where something was happening that required more light than the household's normal evening activities would generate. The household accounts of medieval noble families, where they survive, are remarkable documents, dense with the practical details of daily life, with entries for everything from the purchase of salted fish to the repair of a window shutter to the payment of a visiting musician. Reading them carefully is one of the ways that historians have been able to reconstruct the texture of castle life, and they are, in their own way, records of the pressures that a clandestine arrangement would impose on the household's normal patterns of consumption. A castle run in a secret is a castle in which some things are being consumed in ways that do not match the official account of what is happening inside it. The accounts, read by a careful steward, might begin to tell a story that compilers had not intended. This is one of the reasons that the preparation for a secret marriage had to be conducted, as far as possible, without leaving marks on the castle's official record. A meeting that required additional candles might be managed with fewer candles than ideal. A message that might have been written on parchment taken from the castle's stores might instead be written on a scrap of material that had been brought in from outside. The materials of clandestine communication had, as much as possible, to be invisible within the castle's normal accounting of its own resources. And this invisibility was itself a form of skill, the skill of leaving no trace, of passing through a system of observation and record-keeping in a way that did not accumulate legible evidence. The formal occasions of the castle's year provided both opportunity and risk for those managed in secret. At Christmas, at Easter, at the great feasts of the church's calendar, the castle's full household came together in a way that the ordinary days of the year did not produce. Guests arrived. Entertainment was elaborate. The great hall was at its most ceremonial, and the social rules that organised it were temporarily loosened in ways that created both more freedom and more scrutiny. More freedom because the crowd was larger and harder to track, and because the festive atmosphere permitted a wider range of social interaction than the ordinary day. More scrutiny because the greater number of people in the building meant more eyes and ears, and because the heightened emotion of the festive season could make behavioural signals more legible than they would be in the flat calm of an ordinary working day. A castle at Christmas was a beautiful thing. The great hall was hung with greenery, holly and ivy and bay, brought in from the woods and the garden. The central fire was larger than usual. The household was gathered in its fullest number. The musicians played throughout the evening. The food was the best the season allowed. The stored provisions of a year's agricultural work concentrated in a few days of exceptional eating. The Lord gave gifts to the members of his household according to their rank. The servants received new livery. The children of the household ran between the tables with the special freedom that feast days allowed. And in the middle of all this abundance and ceremony, the people who held the castle's secret moved through the celebration carrying their knowledge with the same composed outward ease that they brought to every other occasion. The feast was an occasion when the social hierarchy was simultaneously reaffirmed and, in small ways, suspended. The misrule of the Christmas season, the licentious reversal of social order that was expressed in games and jokes, and the temporary elevation of a lord of misrule from the lower household, was not a genuine suspension of hierarchy, but a performance of its robustness. The hierarchy could be mocked and playfully inverted precisely because it was secure. The lord who allowed his servants to tease him at Christmas was demonstrating the strength of his position, not its weakness. And within this framework of playful suspension, small violations of the ordinary rules of social interaction could be managed with relative airs. A joke that covered a serious statement, a dance that permitted a few words spoken close, a cup passed from one hand to another with a small pressure of fingers that communicated something the gestures of the ordinary day did not allow. The winter in a medieval castle was physically demanding in ways that shaped the social life of the building as much as any cultural practice. The cold was a constant fact. Stone buildings retain heat poorly, and the great rooms of a medieval castle, for all their size, were heated only by open fires and the body heat of the people crowded round them. The windows, covered with wooden shutters or animal bladders, rather than glass in most of the castle's functional spaces, were kept closed as much as possible in cold weather, making the interior dark and often smoky. The smell of the building in winter, of damp stone, of smoke, of the rushes on the floor with their accumulated debris, of many bodies in close proximity, was a smell that its inhabitants lived within so completely that they ceased to notice it, just as they ceased to notice the cold that has become the unremarkable background of every waking hour. In this physical environment, the desire for warmth was itself a form of social organization. People gathered around fires. They clustered together for the warmth of proximity. The great bed of the lord and lady, hung with heavy curtains and piled with fur coverings, was a necessity in a world where the temperatures of a private chamber in January could fall to near freezing. The women of the household shared sleeping arrangements that kept them physically warm, several women sharing a bed and the bedclothes, the warmth of their bodies supplementing the inadequate heat of the room's fire. In these sleeping arrangements, late-night conversations were possible that the daytime did not allow. Conversations conducted in whispers in the darkness, with the consciousness that other women in the bed might or might not be sleeping. It was in these nighttime conversations, historians have sometimes suggested, that some of the most important communications of castle life took place. The darkness and the physical proximity and the apparent security of a room full of sleeping women created a space that was different from any other space in the castle. Intimate, private, quiet, and paradoxically less supervised than almost any other moment of the day. A woman who needed to speak with her closest companion could choose a moment in the night when the other women in the room seemed to be sleeping, and could say things in that darkness that she could not say in the solar or the great hall or the garden. The risk was real. A woman who was not asleep could hear everything. But the need was also real, and in the weeks before a significant decision, the temptation to speak was often stronger than the counsel of prudence. The relationship between sleeping and waking in a medieval castle was different from the modern experience of sleep in ways that are relevant to understanding the social life of the night. Medieval people typically slept in 2 sessions, with a period of waking in the middle of the night that were considered entirely normal. This period of wakings, sometimes called first sleep and second sleep, was used for various purposes. Prayer was common. Intimate conversation between spouses was common. Practical tasks that the daytime did not allow could be accomplished in this quiet middle of the night time. And for someone with a secret, this period of reliable waking at the dead of the night was a period in which the castle was at its quietest and the risk of observation was at its lowest. A period in which, if a brief meeting needed to be arranged, it could be arranged with the greatest chance of passing undetected. The question of how 2 people who've been separated by the castle's social geography managed to find each other in the night is one that the historical record occasionally illuminates with specific and revealing detail. A servant who agreed to wake one party and guide them through a dark corridor, a prearranged signal, a candle in a window, a scratch at a specific door that indicated when the meeting could take place, a route through the castle that avoided the sleeping guards, or that used a passage that the guards were not tasked with watching. The navigation of a large dark castle at night required familiarity with its architecture that only long residents could provide, and the successful use of that architecture for clandestine purposes required, in addition, a careful observation of the guards' habits and routines, of the schedules that governed when different parts of the building were checked and when they were not. The guards themselves, the men tasked with securing the castle's interior at night, occupied a peculiar social position. They were soldiers, or soldiers' deputies, men whose primary role was defensive rather than domestic. Their knowledge of the castle's interior was practical rather than social. They knew which doors needed to be locked and which passages needed to be checked. They did not necessarily know the details of the social life of the household above them, and what they observed in their nightly rounds they were not expected to analyse in terms of its social implications. A figure moving quietly through a corridor might, or might not, register as unusual to a guard whose attention was primarily oriented toward the external threats that were his primary concern. The social invisibility that servants enjoyed in a castle, the way that a figure in servant dress moving purposefully through the building attracted less attention than a figure in noble dress, was a social invisibility that could, in specific circumstances, be borrowed by people who understood how to use it. All of this, the mechanics of clandestine communication, the navigation of castle geography, the management of servants' loyalties, the exploitation of the castle's temporal rhythms, was in service of a moment that was, in its spur, very simple. Two people standing in a specific place, speaking specific words, in the presence of a small number of witnesses. The marriage that canon law recognised was not a ceremony. It was a speech act. The words were its substance. The elaborate preparations were in service not of creating a ceremony, but of creating a moment in which the words could be spoken. Everything that happened before the secret marriage was in the end about getting to that moment, to the brief, irreversible, legally binding exchange of consent that would change everything, even as it looked from the outside like nothing at all. And when that moment was over, the castle continued. The stone walls stood, the fires burned in the hearths, the servants did their work, the steward checked his accounts. The lord sat at the high table in the great hall and looked out over the household that he believed he controlled. The lady sat beside him and thought whatever she thought. The candles burned down and were replaced. The bells rang for the hours of the office. The horses were watered and fed. The kitchen prepared the evening meal. The dogs lay in the rushes near the fire. And in the middle of all this ordinary continuity, a secret waited. Patient, compact, already accomplished, to waiting for the moment when it would become the official story. When the gap between the castle's appearance and the castle's reality would close, and the world would have to accommodate what had already, quietly and irrevocably, happened. That moment was still ahead. But the castle, which had been the stage for the preparation of the secret, was now the vessel that held it, and it would hold it for a while longer, as patiently and impassively as it held everything else that had ever happened inside its walls. Sleep now. The castle is quiet. The fires are banked. The guards are at their posts. In the women's quarters the candles have been extinguished, and the household sleeps, and the stone walls hold their silence, and somewhere in that silence a secret waits for morning. The betrothal gift was, in medieval noble culture, a physical object of considerable significance. When a formal betrothal was contracted between two families, it was customary for the parties to exchange tokens: a ring, a clasp, a piece of cloth, an item of jewellery, that served as material confirmation of the promise being made. These objects carried legal and symbolic weight. They were mentioned in betrothal agreements. They were produced as evidence in ecclesiastical court proceedings. They were kept and treasured. and their presence in a person's possession was understood to speak to the reality of a commitment that words on parchment alone could not fully convey. The giving of a private token, a ring, a ribbon, a small object that was meaningful to the giver, was one of the characteristic gestures of a clandestine relationship, and it was also one of the most legally significant. A ring given with the words that constituted a pledge of marriage, or exchanged simultaneously with those words, was a ring that could subsequently be produced in court as evidence that the exchange had taken place. The woman who received such a ring, and who kept it, wearing it in private, hiding it in the bottom of a small chest, wrapping it in cloth and concealing it among her possessions, was preserving evidence of her own agency in a situation in which her family would eventually attempt to characterize her as a passive object of another man's schemes. The keeping of a secret token required its own careful management. A ring that was unexpectedly discovered in a noblewoman's possessions could itself become a source of dangerous questions. A small chest was not secure against the searches that might follow a discovery. The hiding of an object inside a castle that was regularly cleaned and maintained, in which servants moved through every space as part of their daily work, was a more demanding exercise than it might seem. Objects were found, servants noticed things. The discovery of something that should not have been in a particular place was exactly the kind of anomaly that travelled quickly through the informal information network of the household. Some men solved this problem by keeping the token not in the castle but on their persons, wearing the ring on a cord around the neck, concealed beneath the layers of their clothing, or carrying a small object tucked into a hidden pocket in their dress. Medieval women's dress, for all its elaborate public appearance, contained a number of spaces for private concealment that the elaborate outer garments disguised. The pockets and pouches that were tied beneath the outermost layers of a noblewoman's dress were not visible from the outside and were accessible only to the woman herself or the maid who helped her dress. These hidden spaces were used for practical purposes, for small sums of money, for keys, for the personal items that every person carries through their day, but they also served for a woman who needed them, as spaces where a secret object could rest against the body, intimate and invisible. The body itself, in this context, becomes a kind of archive. The woman who carried a token against her skin was carrying physical evidence of her own private history, in a form that no one else could read or access without her cooperation. In a world where almost nothing was truly private, where the castle's architecture and social organization were designed to make individual behavior legible to the community, the body's hidden spaces, the interior of a closed hand, the skin beneath clothing, the silent cavity of memory, were among the few sites of genuine privacy available. And it is perhaps not surprising that these private spaces were used with great care by people who had things they needed to keep. The moment of dressing in the morning was one of the moments when a noblewoman's privacy was at its most structurally guaranteed, and also at its most socially managed. The lady was not dressed by herself. She had attendants who helped her with the elaborate layers of her costume, who laced her into a gown, who arranged her hair and placed a headdress. These attendants saw her body. They handled her clothing. They were, in the necessary intimacy of the dressing process, closer to her physical person than almost any other people in her life outside of the physician and the childbirth chamber. And yet within that intimacy, a skilled waiting woman knew what not to see. The relationship between a noblewoman and her personal attendants was governed by a discretion that was as professionally essential as the physical skill of managing the costume itself. A waiting woman who helped her mistress dress was, in this sense, a figure of considerable tacit power. She knew things, physical things, that no one else in the household knew. The management of that knowledge was part of her professional identity, and a woman whose waiting woman was a genuine confidant had, in the dressing room and the undressing room and all the intimate spaces of daily physical care, a degree of privacy from the rest of the household that the castle's open social life did not offer anywhere else. It was in these spaces that the most sensitive conversations of the prehistory of a secret marriage could take place. In the 15 minutes of the morning dressing, in the privacy of the wardrobe chamber where the clothes were kept, and the body was most vulnerable, and the conversation was most protected by the structural intimacy of the moment. The wardrobe chamber, the room where clothing was stored and maintained, was itself a significant space in the castle's geography of privacy. It was a working room, occupied primarily by women, where the household's textiles were kept, repaired, and prepared for use. The smells of the wardrobe room were distinctive: cedar and lavender, used to discourage moths; the faint animal smell of fur-lined garments; the particular smell of the fine wool and silk of formal dress. The room was warm and relatively quiet, its work requiring concentration and precision, and the presence of people working there was unremarkable. It was exactly the kind of space in which a significant private conversation could take place without attracting attention, because the conversations of women at textile work were a normal and expected part of the household's daily life. The textiles themselves, the clothing, the hangings, the bed curtains, the table linen, constituted a significant portion of the castle household's wealth, and their maintenance was a serious responsibility. The annual inspection of the household's textiles, the repair of damaged items, the making of new garments for the household's use, all of this was work that occupied the women of the household through significant portions of the year. A young woman who had grown up in this work knew its rhythms and its spaces intimately. She knew which corner of the wardrobe room was out of sight of the door. She knew when the senior attendant would be at the other end of the room. She knew, in other words, the geography of the domestic spaces she moved through every day with the same precision that a military commander knows the geography of terrain he has campaigned over, as a series of positions and possibilities, of places that offered advantage and places that offered exposure. The knowledge of textile production and maintenance was itself a form of literacy, a way of reading and writing in the material language of cloth and colour. The embroidery that occupied the hands of noble women in the long hours of the solar had its own vocabulary of symbols, its own capacity to carry meaning beyond the purely decorative. A particular flower in a particular arrangement, worked in silk on a piece of linen, might mean nothing to anyone who had not been told its significance, and everything to someone who had. The giving of an embroidered object, a handkerchief, a panel for a garment, was a recognized form of personal communication in medieval noble culture, and the specific designs worked into an object could carry messages that the object's maker and recipient understood and no one else did. Whether these possibilities were used in the specific circumstances of a clandestine relationship preparing for a secret marriage is something that the historical record occasionally confirms and more often suggests without direct evidence. What it confirms is that the women of medieval noble households were not passive recipients of the social rules that governed them, but active and intelligent navigators of those rules who used every instrument available to them, legal, social, architectural, material, to act on their own behalf in a world that was not designed to accommodate their individual desires. The secret marriage was one expression of this agency. The embroidered message was another. The trusted confidant was another. The carefully managed dressing room conversation was another. Together, they constitute a portrait of intelligence and determination that the official record of the medieval period, with its focus on the activities of men in the public world, has not always found easy to see. But it is there, in the records, in the ecclesiastical court proceedings that describe the specific circumstances of how a particular marriage was contracted, we hear women's voices speaking directly, describing what was said, when, where, and by whom, asserting the reality of their own consent, insisting on the validity of their own choices. These voices are careful and precise. They know the legal framework. They use its vocabulary correctly. They understand exactly what needs to be established to make the marriage hold, and they speak with a confidence that suggests they had thought through what they were going to say long before they were required to say it in a court of law. The woman who ultimately prevailed in an ecclesiastical court proceeding over a secret marriage was often the woman who had, from the beginning, understood the situation as one in which a record needed to be created. The witnesses she had brought to the exchange of vows were not merely witnesses to a romantic moment. They were the foundation of a legal case that she was building in advance. The words she'd spoken were not merely the expression of a feeling. They were a legal speech act, and she had spoken them in exactly the right form with exactly the right witnesses to make them irrefutable. The secret marriage that looked, from outside, like an act of romantic impulsiveness was, in many cases, an act of extraordinary legal intelligence. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about what happened before a secret marriage in a medieval castle. The preparation was not merely practical. The management of communication, the navigation of architecture, the cultivation of confidants. It was also intellectual. The woman at the centre of the arrangement had studied her situation. She had thought through the legal framework. She had understood what would be needed to make the thing she was doing stick. And she had acted, in the end, not out of ignorance or passion alone, but out of the full knowledge of what she was doing and what it meant. The castle that surrounded her, with all its apparatus of control, its hierarchy, its architecture of separation, its network of observation, had not produced a woman who was passive and compliant. It had produced a woman who understood the system she lived within with the intimacy that only long residence and careful attention could provide, and who was prepared to use that understanding in service of her own judgment about her own life. The stone walls had not contained her, they had educated her, and the education they had provided was one that the people who built those walls had not entirely intended to give. The long history of such women, and it is a long history, running through the medieval centuries from the earliest ecclesiastical court records to the latest, is a history of people operating at the intersection of official constraint and private intelligence. They did not overthrow the system, they did not demand the rights that later centuries would come to recognize. They worked within the system's own internal contradictions, finding the places where one set of rules could be used to circumvent another, where the church's insistence on the primacy of consent could be deployed against the family's insistence on the management of marriage. They were not revolutionaries, they were extraordinarily skillful navigators. And the castle, in this reading, is not merely the setting of their story, but one of its central characters. It is the environment that shaped them, that gave them their knowledge of its own geography and social dynamics, that provided both the constraints they worked against and the resources they worked with. The women who made secret marriages in medieval castles knew those castles intimately. Every doorway, every habit of every servant, every moment of relative privacy in the castle's daily schedule. They knew them because they lived in them, because those buildings were their entire world for years of their lives, and because people who are confined to a small world will inevitably know it completely. The stone is silent now. The castles that remain stand open to visitors on summer days, and the tourists who walk through them imagine the drama of tournaments and battles and great feasts. They do not always think to imagine the quieter dramas that took place in the solar and the wardrobe room and the garden, the careful conversations, the folded notes, the brief decisive moments when words were spoken that changed everything. But those dramas were theirs too. They were, in their way, as consequential as the battles. They decided who would marry whom, whose land would pass to whose heirs, what the political landscape of the next generation would look like. They were fought with words rather than swords, with legal knowledge rather than military force, in spaces of domestic intimacy rather than fields of open conflict. And they were won, sometimes, by the person who seemed the least powerful in the situation. The young woman in the solar with her needlework, the careful daughter of a careful family, the obedient subject of a hierarchy that had decided her future before she was old enough to understand what it was deciding. She won when she won because she had paid attention, because she had learned, because she had understood in the fullness of time that the system she lived within had given her tools she could use, and because she had used them, quietly and decisively in the moment when the time was right. Sleep well. The castle is quiet now. The fires are low, the stones are cold, and somewhere in the dark of the night, the world is exactly as complicated and as human as it has always been. The monastery that sat within a day's ride of most major medieval castles was, in ways that are not always immediately obvious, a significant participant in the social world of the nobility. Monasteries were centres of literacy, of legal knowledge, and of the ecclesiastical administration that governed marriage. The monks and friars, who moved between religious houses and noble households as spiritual advisors, confessors, and educators, were people who understood both the theological framework of canon law and the social dynamics of the households they served. A woman who had access to a learned confessor from a nearby religious house had access to someone who could advise her to walk within the seal of confession on the precise legal requirements for a valid marriage, without any of that advice reaching the ears of her family. The confessor occupied a unique position of trust within the castle's social world. The seal of confession was inviolable. A priest who revealed what had been confessed to him faced serious canonical consequences. This meant that a woman who sought advice in the confessional was seeking it in the one space within the castle social world where the advice she received was genuinely protected from the surveillance that governed all other conversations. A careful woman who needed to understand the legal requirements for a secret marriage might approach this question not directly but obliquely, framing it as a theological inquiry, as a hypothetical question, as a matter of religious education rather than practical planning. A learned confessor who understood what was being asked could answer the theological question accurately, and both parties could maintain the fiction that no specific situation was being discussed. The parish church that served the castle's surrounding village was another node in the ecclesiastical network that governed marriage. The banns, the public announcements of an intended marriage that were required to be read in church on 3 successive Sundays before the ceremony, were a mechanism designed specifically to prevent clandestine marriages by bringing the intended union to public attention and inviting anyone who knew of an impediment to come forward. A secret marriage that bypassed the bans was a marriage that had deliberately circumvented this mechanism. The Church frowned on this, and the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 had specifically required the publication of bans, but it had not and could not declare that a marriage made without bans was invalid. The bans were procedurally required, but not theologically essential. A marriage made without them was irregular and could be punished by penance, but it was still a marriage. This distinction between what was procedurally required and what was theologically essential was one of the central subtleties of medieval marriage law, and it was a distinction that an educated woman planning secret marriage had to understand precisely. She was not trying to make an invalid marriage. She was trying to make a valid marriage by irregular means. The validity of the marriage was her protection. Its irregularity was the thing her family would focus on in attempting to undo it. Understanding the difference between these two things was the foundation of the entire strategy. The education in canon law that a woman needed in order to deploy this strategy was not formally available to her. There were no law schools for women in medieval Europe. The ecclesiastical courts were managed by men. The learned professions that administered the legal system of the Church were entirely male, but the substance of canon law, the doctrines, the rules, the distinctions that governed everyday life, circulated in the culture more broadly than any formal educational institution. It was discussed in sermons. It was addressed in the confessional. It was the subject of the oral tradition that circulated among women in exactly the way described earlier. And a woman who paid attention, who asked intelligent questions in the confessional, who listened carefully to the stories told by older women in the sola, could acquire a working knowledge of the legal framework that was quite sophisticated, even without formal training. The practical knowledge of the law that circulated among medieval women was not the only kind of intelligence they brought to clandestine situations. They also brought a kind of social intelligence, a precise understanding of the personalities and motivations of the people around them. That was, in a world where formal power was unavailable to them, one of their primary instruments of agency. A woman who had spent years in close proximity to the members of her household knew each of them with an intimacy that formal hierarchies did not capture. She knew who was reliable and who was not. She knew who had grievances and who was content. She knew who was watching carefully and who, despite appearing attentive, was distracted by their own concerns. This knowledge was the foundation of every decision she made about who to trust and how much. The management of trust in a clandestine situation was not merely a matter of choosing the right people. It was also a matter of giving each person only as much information as they needed, the principle that later centuries would describe as compartmentalization, but that medieval women practiced without the vocabulary. A waiting woman who was asked to carry a message did not need to know the full context of the message to carry it reliably. A page who was asked to deliver a small packet did not need to know what it contained. A chaplain who was asked to be present in the chapel at a specific hour did not need to know in advance what would be asked of him when he arrived. The distribution of knowledge through a small conspiracy was as carefully managed as the distribution of any other resource, and the woman who managed it well was a woman who understood both the practical mechanics of the situation and the human psychology of the people she was working with. The hours between compline, the last prayer of the day recited as the household prepared for sleep, and the ringing of matins in the small hours of the night were the hours of the castle's deepest quiet. The great hall was dark. The kitchen fires were banked to coals. The servants who had no private chamber had settled in their sleeping places. The guards moved on their regular circuits of the walls and gates, and in the private chambers above, the members of the noble household were in the shifting space between waking and sleep that the medieval understanding of night recognized as its own kind of time, different from the purposeful activity of the day, and different again from the complete unconsciousness of deep sleep. It was in this liminal time that the deepest private thinking of a life under social constraint was done. The woman who lay awake in the dark, her waiting women breathing quietly around her, was alone with her thoughts in a way that the daylight hours almost never allowed. She could turn her situation over in her mind without the constant management of her outer expression that the daylight required. She could feel the full weight of what she was planning, or what she had already done. She could rehearse the conversation she would need to have, the things she would need to say in the ecclesiastical court if it came to that, the arguments she would need to make to the people who would oppose her. She could, in the privacy of her own mind, be entirely herself, not the composed, obedient daughter of a noble house that the daylight required her to be, but the person who had made a decision about her own life and was living with all the consequences of that decision. The dark was, paradoxically, a space of power for people whose power in the daytime was limited. It was the space in which plans were made and revised, in which courage was gathered and fear acknowledged, in which the gap between the official self and the private self was temporarily closed. A woman who was maintaining a performance of normalcy through the daylight hours was, in those dark waking hours, released from the performance. And the release was necessary. Not merely psychologically, but practically. The performance could only be sustained if it was regularly relieved. The person who could never step outside the role being played was a person who would eventually collapse under its weight. The dark was where the role could be set down, and the person who wore it could rest. And when the morning came, as it always did, the bells rang for praying, and the household stirred, and their performance resumed. The composure was reassembled, the face that showed nothing was put back on, the words that said the right things were prepared and deployed. The day unfolded in its ordinary sequence of obligations and routines, and through it all the woman moved in the knowledge of what she'd already done and what was still to come, carrying the secret with the steadiness of someone who has made peace with the weight of it. This is what it meant to wait in a medieval castle. Not the waiting of passive expectation, but the waiting of active management. The daily renewal of a decision, the daily maintenance of a situation, the daily performance of a role that no longer matched the private reality. It was demanding work, and it was invisible work, and it was the work that most often went unrecorded in the histories that later centuries wrote about the medieval period. But it was in its own way as significant as anything done in the great hall or the field of battle. It was the work of making a life under difficult circumstances by the means available. The castle holds this history within its stones, but the stones do not speak of it. Walk through the rooms of any surviving medieval residence, the long galleries, the chapels with their cold floors, the private chambers with their narrow windows, and you walk through spaces where this kind of history happened. The formality of the architecture conceals it. The silence of the empty rooms erases it. But it was there. It is always there. In any place where human beings have lived and struggled and loved and managed their lives within the constraints of the world they found themselves in. And now the night is deep, and the story is long, and the castle has told as much of its quiet history as the night will hold. Rest. Let the stone walls stand around the dark. Let the fires burn low. Let the woman in the solar finally set down her work and close her eyes. Let the secret keep itself for one more night in the silence that is its natural element. The morning will come. It always comes. And when it does, the world will be exactly as complicated and as human as it was the night before. For now, though, the castle sleeps, and the silence is enough.